Presidio, an army base is shielding a murderer.
The proper way to do things. You're going to do it the proper way.
And now, the military and the law have a score to settle.
I don't want you seeing him.
Is that an order?
Yes, it is.
Sean Connery and Meg Ryan. The Presidio, tomorrow at 10 on BBC1.
On BBC2 shortly, amidst the eventful lives of a Bradford community, a pair of teenagers share the pain and pleasure of young love. Blood and Peaches, the first of a two-part drama.
On the left-hand side of the screen, you're looking at life in Britain in the 1930s, when poor people expected to live years less than their richer counterparts. On the right-hand side is Britain in the 1990s, where poor people expect to live years less than their richer counterparts. So, how long will the poor be with us? Panorama reports in half an hour.
And that follows the 9 o'clock news, now on BBC1, with Peter Sissons.
50 years after the destruction of Dresden, the former enemies speak of reconciliation and the lessons of war. The Duke of Kent lays a wreath as Germany's president says Dresden can't be equated with the crimes of the Nazis. In Chechnya, the first serious talks between Russians and rebels bring agreement not to use heavy weapons. And a former Test cricketer owns up to his part in cricket's bribery story, but says it was a joke. Good evening. At this hour, 50 years ago, the first of hundreds of RAF bombers had just arrived over the night's target, the city of Dresden in eastern Germany. By the dawn, much of it was blazing rubble. 35,000 or more were dead, and another name was added to history's ledger of mass destruction. Yet today's commemoration was an occasion where reconciliation far outweighed recrimination. Germany's President, Roman Herzog, said nothing offset the atrocities of the Nazis, nor was anyone being indicted or expected to show remorse.
At a clearing in the forest at the edge of Dresden, which is the city's cemetery for its war dead, they hold such a ceremony every year. But this one was special. The Queen was represented by the Duke of Kent in an unprecedented wreath-laying at the monument to the 35,000 victims of the firebombing 50 years ago. The royal presence mattered to the Germans. The service which had bombed Dresden, the Royal Air Force, was represented not by one of its own, but by a soldier. Field Marshal Sir Peter Inge, Chief of the Defence Staff, together with his counterparts from Germany and the United States. Nothing was said, except by the German general on the long walk out.
I think the fact that His Royal Highness, the Duke of Kent, was here today to honor the dead Dresdeners is a clear indication that both of our nations are looking into the future and that reconciliation is the catchword of the day and not to look back.
But this is a time for looking back. On that night 50 years ago, when nearly 800 Lancaster bombers unloaded their lethal cargoes of incendiary and high-explosive bombs on Dresden, set fire to the city centre and destroyed it. The action was taken in response to pressure from Stalin to help the Russians advancing towards Dresden from the east. Those who condemn it today include the bishop of the sister city of Coventry.
I certainly think that the time has come to acknowledge openly and clearly, supported by every reputable historian and the whole understanding of the event, that we were wrong. The whole of the war had a criminal dimension to it. I mean, at that point, I think it's something into which we were swept by a sort of whirlwind.
This is a view of history strongly contested by Bomber Command survivors. Colin Campbell was a navigator with the second wave of Lancasters over Dresden.
It was our belief, of course, that we were contributing in our small way to the defeat of Nazi Germany, and that hopefully it would bring about the closer end to hostilities.
And among Dresdeners who survived, many by escaping through cellars and tunnels like these, there is today remarkably little bitterness against the Allies.
We guilt is with Hitler and with fascism. They started the war. And it was quite natural that the British and the Americans would strike back.
The principal ceremony this afternoon was about remembrance and not at all the apportioning of blame. The speech most closely drafted and studied was that by the German President, Roman Herzog.
Niemandem im Raum hier geht es Anklage.
No one present in this room intends to indict anyone or expects anyone to show remorse or indulge in self-accusation. No one wants to offset the wrongs committed by Germans in the Nazi state against anything else.
Tonight, an ecumenical service was held in the Kreuzkirche, the city's principal Protestant church, itself destroyed in the bombing and since rebuilt. The people of Dresden were addressed by the Duke of Kent, and what he said was the closest to an apology that there has been.
Wir bedauern zutiefst das Leid, das alle Seiten im Krieg erfahren.
We deeply regret the suffering on all sides in the war. Today we remember especially that of the people of Dresden. And he had with him a sketch of the great cross which Britain is to give to the rebuilding of another church, the Frauenkirche, which has been a symbol of the city's destruction. Outside the Frauenkirche tonight, the people of Dresden were gathering with candles and prayers to be in place at exactly the moment when, 50 years ago, hundreds of British bombers were overhead. Martin Bell, BBC News, Dresden.
Russian forces have reached agreement with fighters from the breakaway Republic of Chechnya on a ceasefire covering heavy weapons. The accord followed several hours of talks between the two sides in the neighbouring Republic of Ingushetia. The Russian government says there'll be further talks on Wednesday, aimed at widening the truce and ending 9 weeks of fighting.
After 2 months of war, this is the first ceasefire that doesn't look completely doomed from the start. Its chances aren't great, since the two sides' goals remain unreconcilable, but at least the Russian commander says he's already told his heavy armour to stop firing, and talks are set to continue on Wednesday.
I hope that the topic of the negotiations will not be only exchange of dead bodies and prisoners. I think it's high time to talk seriously about maybe demilitarized zones in Chechnya, about moving to true peace.
Colonel Maschadov, Chechnya's military commander and representative at the talks, is beginning to look more important than General Dudayev for the outcome of the conflict. Much will depend on the extent to which he actually controls his fighters, scattered around Chechnya's towns and villages. Moscow appears to be banking on the hope that the Chechens, having lost Grozny, now feel their backs are up against the wall and that they'll cave in to Russia's demands. Despite the devastation of Grozny, Russia still hopes to hold elections there sometime this year. With thousands of casualties now on both sides, there's growing public pressure for an end to the campaign. Previous ceasefires in this conflict have broken down almost at once. But if this one holds, it'll be a relief not just to the long-suffering people of Chechnya. President Yeltsin is due to address a joint session of Parliament on Thursday, and he badly needs a success to boost his standing. Angus Roxburgh, BBC News, Moscow.
Here, the government appears certain to avoid an embarrassing defeat in the Commons over Europe tonight. MPs will vote in the next hour on a Liberal Democrat motion calling for a referendum on any substantial changes to the European Union. Some Tory Eurosceptics will support the motion, but Labour has decided not to.
Tories arrived at a meeting of the Eurosceptic Bruges Group tonight to hear a demand by a former minister that Britain shouldn't be, as he put it, frog-marched or goose-stepped into a single currency without the people's say-so in a referendum. Neil Hamilton said that with ex-ministers Lord Tevitt and Sir Norman Fowler backing a referendum, the government's remaining ministers might soon all be ex-ministers too, if they didn't come to agree. Liberal Democrats are tonight giving MPs the chance to vote for a referendum on Europe.
Europe is far too important an issue for this country, for it to be left to an internal spat in the Conservative Party and the minor mathematics of the Conservative whips. This debate, Madam Speaker, must now be widened beyond the confines of the Conservative Party to include the public at large.
The Europe minister's response to an invitation to confirm the government's open mind on the question was somewhat tentative.
It's a pretty easy question when you ask a Minister of State whether he agrees with the Prime Minister. And I think that is the case still. But
he did finally confirm the official maybe. Referendums tend to be used in British politics only when governing parties are divided, as Labour were in 1975, and pros and antis combined on cross-party platforms. As the keenly pro-European Liberals had intended, tonight's call for a future referendum displayed not only the split in Tory ranks, but the niggles on the Labour side too. Labour's front bench says it's too early to decide on whether a referendum or an election is most appropriate. But that's disappointed the party's anti-Brussels brigade.
If the Labour Party voted with the Liberal Democrats, with the Conservative rebels, they would defeat the government and bring about a House of Commons resolution that we will have a referendum. So I'm amazed that we've turned down the opportunity of defeating the government.
Labour says the Liberal Democrats showed no interest in a common accord to defeat the government. Mr Ashdown's team insist they offered to share their motion with Labour and agree wording to suit them, but got no response. The government, happy the opposition has missed a trick, is so relaxed that ministers won't even bother to turn up and vote. Robin Oakley, BBC News, Westminster.
The frontrunner in the French presidential elections, Prime Minister Edouard Balladur, has opened his campaign by calling for a single European Union currency to be introduced as soon as possible. But he said countries with objections should be allowed a temporary opt-out from the arrangement.
Edouard Balladur made his reputation as a competent economic manager, not an exciting campaigner. He clearly does not relish the demands of the election trail. But he is now increasingly spelling out a clear vision of a European future in which France will play a central role. For him, the debate is not so much whether there will be a single currency, but when, and how soon France and the rest of Europe can satisfy the conditions for joining. That could happen, he believes, in less than 2 years.
I have already expressed my commitment to the quickest possible transition to a single currency by 1997, if enough European countries meet the conditions.
If the French franc is to be replaced by a single European currency, there will be a cost. France will have to reduce its budget deficit to meet one of the conditions laid down in the Maastricht Treaty. That will make it harder to find funds to tackle the problems of unemployment and poverty, which are high on the election agenda. The unemployment total stands at almost 3.5 million, and whatever the economic strain imposed by meeting the single currency target, Mr Balladur has promised to create 1 million jobs over the next 5 years. He was also careful to stress, without naming Britain, that countries favouring a slower approach to monetary union should be allowed a temporary opt-out. But it's clear that if Edouard Balladur wins the French presidency, and he is a strong favourite, France will be pushing hard for the rapid creation of a single European currency. Kevin Connolly, BBC News, Paris.
21 Serbs have been charged with war crimes for their treatment of prisoners at the Omarska camp in Bosnia. Pictures of Muslim and Croat prisoners at the camp caused an international outcry in 1992. The United Nations Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia expects to start holding trials in the spring.
Omarska was the most notorious of the Serb camps. Here, according to the War Crimes Tribunal, prisoners were starved, tortured with metal rods and rifle butts, and frequently executed. 21 Bosnian Serbs have been charged with crimes that include genocide, murder and rape. But although the tribunal has issued arrest warrants for the men, most of them will probably never stand trial. The Bosnian Serb leader, Radovan Karadzic, has already refused to hand them over to the court. He claims the constitution of his republic does not allow them to be extradited. Only one of the suspects, this man, Dusan Tadic, is in custody. He was arrested in Germany last year after Bosnian Muslim refugees there recognized him. His victims used to call Tadic the butcher of Omarska.
He liked to tour the camp at night. People would say in fear, Dusan Tadic has arrived. He would call Muslims out, one by name, and beat them and then kill them.
Today, members of the War Crimes Tribunal made it clear they also want to bring to justice the leaders who allowed such atrocities to happen.
At the very least, leaders in positions of authority will be held accountable
for failing to take action to prevent those crimes from being committed, or for failing to punish those who have committed them.
Omashka was only one of several Serbian camps where Muslim and Croat prisoners suffered appallingly. But the United Nations Tribunal cannot try suspects in their absence. So few of those who carried out ethnic cleansing and other outrages in the former Yugoslavia will ever pay for their crimes. Ben Brown, BBC News.
There's been a sharp rise in the price of goods leaving Britain's factories, an indication of inflationary pressures in the economy. Higher material costs were mainly responsible for pushing factory output prices up by almost 1% in January, raising the annual rate of increase to 3.4%.
MGN Technology makes computers and is the happy face of the recovery. It's recently doubled its Burnley workforce, and now it's looking for another 40 staff. But like every other manufacturer at present, MGN faces rising raw material costs. Not because of inflation in Britain, but because world commodity prices were rising at the end of last year. Copper prices rose 50%, but MGN's markets want lower, not higher prices.
We're in a very competitive industry, and we always must try and hold all component costs to ourselves and not pass them on to customers at all if we possibly can. There comes a point, of course, where it's inevitable that those kind of increased costs must be passed on.
The prices of fuel and material bought by industry are notoriously unstable. Since early 1990, they were falling for 2.5 years, then shot up, fell back, and rose again sharply in recent months. By contrast, manufacturers' own prices at the factory gate were much steadier, thanks to a squeeze on profits. Factory gate inflation gradually reduced to barely 2% last summer, before spurting to 3.4% last month. Underlying inflation in the shops is even more cushioned against volatile material prices, falling steadily from its peak in 1990 to its trough last autumn, before edging up gradually at the end of last year. Fear that manufacturers like MGN would start passing on the higher raw material costs in higher prices to their customers has been one of the main reasons why interest rates have been raised 3 times since September. And today's jump in factory gate inflation from 2.8 to 3.4% will be seized on as justification after the event. But most of that increase was the direct result of the increases in excise duties, which the Chancellor imposed in December in order to claw back the revenue that he lost when the House of Commons threw out the second stage of VAT on domestic light and fuel. Accordingly, this inflation blip will be reversed when in April there is no increase in VAT on gas and electricity. As a reason for raising interest rates meanwhile, it looks distinctly homemade. Peter Jay, BBC News at number 11.
The advertising agency Saatchi & Saatchi has failed in the High Court to stop the company's former chairman, Maurice Saatchi, starting a rival business with his brother and 3 former colleagues. The agency agreed that it had no power to stop Mr. Saatchi setting up in competition, but argued that 3 of its senior executives who planned to join the new company had broken their contracts. A 39-year-old woman has appeared in court accused of abducting the newborn baby, Lydia Owens, from Glan Clwyd Hospital near Rhyl last Friday. Susan Ann Brooke from Rhyl was remanded on bail at Prestatyn Magistrates Court on condition that she stays at a psychiatric hospital. Lydia was returned to her parents after being found in a bungalow a few miles from the hospital on Saturday. The Scottish Secretary, Ian Lang, has called devolution a one-way street to independence with no return. His comments followed last night's debate in Edinburgh between Labour and the Scottish National Party on the constitutional future for Scotland. Labour's George Robertson called for a devolved parliament within the United Kingdom, but the SNP wants full independence within the European Union.
Scottish constitutional change is opposition territory. For Labour, George Robertson. For the SNP, Alex Salmond. A straight contest between the 2 parties commanding most support in Scotland. Labour promised a Scottish Parliament within the Union. George Robertson insisted it wouldn't break up Britain and said he'd give up his Westminster career to serve in it.
I believe we are setting up a major institution, a new Parliament for Scotland.
Right,
and I would be proud to be a member of this Parliament.
The SNP leader would sit in a Scottish Parliament too, but only as a halfway house to independence. nationalists regard the devolution of power with suspicion.
Devolution would not solve that question, the real question, the Westminster question. It would leave the commanding heights not just of the Scottish economy, but of Scottish democracy itself. They still would be left in London.
If there were a change of government, the venue of this televised debate could house a Scottish Parliament.
Good morning. Good morning.
But the Conservatives have a dire financial warning. According to the Scottish Secretary Ian Lang, Scots would pay much more tax.
My purpose is to make sure that Scottish Parliament doesn't happen, because I believe it would be so deeply damaging to Scotland's future.
The Liberal Democrats support a Scottish Parliament, but not head-to-head debates.
I don't think there was any great new revelations. I read that Alex Salmond favoured independence and George Robertson wanted devolution within the United Kingdom. Well, we knew that before it started.
Opinion polls over the last few years suggest that more than 3 out of 4 Scots favour some form of constitutional change, whether it be the Scottish Parliament, supported by Labour, or full independence, advocated by the SNP. The arguments we're hearing now, both for and against change, could be central to the next general election campaign. Colin Blaine, BBC News, Edinburgh.
The pools company Vernon's is cutting its charitable donation to the Foundation for Sport and the Arts because the National Lottery is squeezing its profits. The company says its turnover has dropped by 15% since the lottery was launched.
These musicians from the London Festival Orchestra are practicing in their newly refurbished rehearsal room, partly paid for by pools money. The orchestra received a grant of £65,000 from the Foundation for Sport and the Arts, which is funded entirely by the pools companies. The orchestra used their grant to convert a derelict warehouse into their new home. But now, with the pools companies badly hit by the National Lottery, similar future projects could be in danger.
The Foundation for Sport and the Arts has actually been shot in the foot, rather. I don't think the government has thought it through as well as it might have done.
Vernon's, which has already announced job losses, says business is down by 15%. As a result, it's cutting